Good evening. My name is Hildy Fraze-Thiessen, and it's a pleasure to welcome everyone here, those of you who joined us last week for a unique and affecting literary performance by Rudy Wiebe, and those of you joining us for the first time tonight during this 9-week series celebrating the most recent 50 years of Mennonites writing in Canada. For the next 2 weeks, we're focusing in large measure on poetry, on the two writers who at least began as poets in the 1970s. Both Patrick Friesen, who will be featured next week, and David Waltner-Toews, who is with us tonight, have inimitable, very different voices. Each of them has made a palpable impact on the field of Mennonite writing, with a distinctive style and with unforgettable characters, narratives, images, and sensibilities. Before I introduce you to David Waltner-Toews, I'll say a word about next week's writer, Patrick Friesen, who grew up in Steinbach, Manitoba, a town inscribed by a number of writers of Mennonite heritage, most notably, most recently, Miriam Toews in A Complicated Kindness. Patrick Friesen writes evocative, lyrical poetry, usually in long lines that have a haunting quality. His poems tend to be at once immediately accessible and transcendent. I've heard other literary figures speak of him admiringly as perhaps Canada's most spiritual poet. Though he has no use for organized religion as it was played to him in Steinbach, Patrick gives voice to a search for spiritual realities pointed to by the material worlds we occupy. He writes of body and soul, what he calls the red heart and the blue wind. He laments the condition of the man who wants paradise, but his arms aren't long enough. Patrick Friesen's long poem, The Shunning, has been adapted as a stage drama and for dance. Published in 1980, it remains a landmark of Mennonite literature, but is only one of the dozen or so volumes of poetry he's published since 1976. He'll come to us next week from Victoria, BC, where he has lived for quite a long time and where he continues to write. And I hope you'll join us here to hear him. I want to pause just briefly to say there are poets, if there are aspiring poets or poets among you, please note that Patrick Friesen and later in mid-February, Julia Kasdorf are giving 2-hour poetry workshops at the college free of charge. Please pick up a sheet of details that looks like this about these workshops on your way out. You might have seen them on these sheets on the table over there if you're interested in attending a poetry workshop or if you know someone else who might be. And now to return to this evening. David Waltner-Toews. You've had a glimpse of him already. David Waltner-Toews, poet, essayist, writer of fiction and detective fiction, scientist, humorist. I could go on. David Waltner-Toews grew up in Winnipeg, where he attended 1 year of university before setting out to travel over 18 months overland across Europe and Central Asia to India. When he returned to North America, he settled in after a while at Goshen College in Indiana, where he earned a BA in English. It was there that he met Kathy Waltner, the love of his life, and that his first volume of poems, The Inescapable Animal, was published by Pinchpenny Press, 1974. He would soon divert his attention from the humanities to study veterinary science, graduating as a vet in 1978, and then epidemiology with a PhD in 1985, both at the University of Guelph. But he didn't give up poetry, becoming during those years of science training a Turnstone Press author, an honor shared by many Manitoba-based Mennonite writers, including fellow poets Patrick Friesen, Di Brandt, Sarah Clausen, as well as fiction writers Armin Wiebe, David Bergen, Sandra Birdsall, Miriam Toews. They've all been published by Turnstone and others. Turnstone Press in Winnipeg published 3 volumes of David's poetry in 1979, 83, and 88. More volumes of poems followed, published by major literary presses in Canada, including McClelland and Stewart. And his poetic character, Tante Tina, a middle-aged Mennonite woman who would not be repressed, opinionated, outrageous, and endearing, became an icon of Mennonite literature. David was known to perform her, sometimes for fairly sophisticated crowds, like this one, wearing a babushka and a house dress. Though Tanta Tina makes her voice heard in the context of David's poetry, she by no means encompasses or defines his poetic oeuvre, which is made up of poems long and short that often invoke warmly people and places he has known, that speak of his intense care for the earth and its marvels, that embrace and celebrate the small but affecting wonders of our day-to-day lives. It wasn't until 2005 that David Waltner-Toews' first fiction, an award-winning collection of stories entitled One Foot in Heaven, appeared. To some of us who spent our high school years with David in Winnipeg, some of the people and places in that collection were strangely familiar. So that's what was going on in the minds of those teenage boys during those parties in Sylvia's basement. When David's most recent fiction, a Mennonite murder mystery called Fear of Landing, was published by Poison Pen Press in 2008, it was listed by Publishers Weekly in the US as one of the top mysteries of the year. His second murder mystery is in progress. David, founding member of Veterinarians Without Borders Canada, has just retired from the University of Guelph and is delighted to have time now to write exactly what he wants to write. At Guelph since 1987, he taught in the Department of Population Medicine, specializing in zoonoses, diseases people get from animals, including foodborne diseases, and ecosystem approaches to health. As a scientist, he published close to 100 peer-reviewed scholarly papers and 3 books of popular science, including, in the midst of fairly recent fears about bird flu, a natural and cultural history of zoonoses, diseases people get from animals, entitled The Chickens Fight Back, published in 2007, and a book on the ecological and cultural context for foodborne diseases, where he warns of the dangers of promiscuity, particularly as it relates to what we are prepared to eat, to fairly indiscriminately put into our mouths. This one was entitled Food, Sex, and Salmonella, 2008. Forthcoming in the same genre and spirit as these earlier scientific volumes is his study of excrement, the one-word title of which I'll leave unspoken. After all, Justin Trudeau had to apologize recently for speaking it in the House of Commons. This book is sure to be, as one critic said of another of David's popular science projects, occasionally saucy, funny, and contrarian. David and I met on an outdoor skating rink in Winnipeg during a winter much colder than this one when we were 12 years old. We've pretty much kept in touch since then. So it's a personal pleasure and an honor to have the occasion to introduce him to you and to observe that he will take some questions after he's done. A title he gave me for his talk is From a Brotherly Philippic to Tanta Tina to the Mysteries of Disease, Death, and Transformation, Mennonite Reflections on a Life of Poetry and Science. I had to look up that word philippic. It is defined as a verbal denunciation characterized by harsh, often insulting language. I should have looked it up earlier. I'm not sure what we're in for, but I'm eager to find out. So please join me in welcoming the most engaging poet, essayist, writer of fictions and science, David Waltner-Toews.
Thanks, Hildy, for that wonderful introduction. One small correction, my vet degree was actually from Saskatoon. Most people wouldn't care, but the vet schools actually care. There aren't very many of them, and there's fierce competition. So, I better put on my glasses, yeah. I knew there was something wrong looking at this page. Don't laugh. I notice some of you have the same issues. Time to wake up, time to move, to sit up in your padded pew and shake, to grab your neighbor by the collar and shake, stamp down on the carpet till you break both feet on the ground. Time to wake up, time to move, to break the shouting, sterile silence with a cry. Out of the darkness of eternity echoes and re-echoes the unanswered cry, love me, answer ye people, or forever die. Those are fragments from a long philippic, a tirade, a brotherly philippic, which was included in a book of essays called Out of Concern for the Church, a publication of Reformed Church Christian activists and scholars. It is the first and only piece of my writing that I registered with the Canadian Copyright Office. I actually have... Writers don't... what was I thinking? Somebody was going to steal this? Not only that, but it was under the pseudonym D.T. Ivanovich. David Toews, son of John, the Russian version, in case any of you were wondering. In 2006 and again in 2011, I got an email from an insurance salesman in Pennsylvania who had been deeply influenced by the Brotherly Philippic and has used it regularly for campus ministries in which he is involved. He wanted to know what reflections I had after more than 40 years of journeying, if I had other materials to place alongside the original. How can I begin to respond? Writing for me has never been just about writing. It is about who I am. Being a writer is part of my identity, like being male, heterosexual, or Caucasian, genetically programmed, socially molded, and difficult to explain to those who aren't that way. In preparing for this talk, I pillaged from other pieces I've written over the years. This has been a scary experience, dumpster diving into my soul. As a teenager, I was a true believer, and my writing reflected that. But I also, regretfully to me as a Mennonite brethren, was human. My relationship with writing was lust at first glance, a deep, physical, sinful desire for poetry. And it took a long time before I discovered that she had a sense of humor. Fragments from my teenage years, which I once sent to Jack Dewick in a darkly despairing letter, speak of Chipper Dipper, Jack the Ripper, lustful flesh of a nightclub stripper. Hildy. I suppose that says it all, the desire and the loathing, the need and the rejection of that need. We Mennonite brethren didn't have needs. We didn't have bodies. Well, we had bodies from which we were to be saved. We didn't have desires. So what was all this I was feeling? If the devil, as we are told, was in the details, then the devil lived in every little muscle of my body. Sadly, I had notebooks full of stuff like Chipper Dipper. Most of it never oozed past my notebooks and maybe a few tolerant friends. Mennonite brethren, of which I was the most ardent among the ardent, didn't really take poetry seriously as poetry. There were hymns, of course, and rhymes that exhorted people to be good, but poetry? What good was that? If it was to be a passion, it had to be a secret passion. I remember my first crush. My grade 5 teacher, in a stroke of genius or extreme frustration, asked me to write a poem as punishment for talking in class. How did she know I was even interested? In poetry, I mean, not punishment. It was near Christmas. I wrote something that rhymed about wise men, a kind of upbeat version of T.S. Eliot. Had I read T.S. Eliot? I don't remember. The teacher liked the poem so well that it was published in a Manitoba Society Teacher's Journal and read on CFAM radio. Power. Poetry as punishment and glory. It is something I have wrestled with my whole life. Sometimes I have felt like the Jewish prophet Hosea, who was asked by God to marry an unrepentant prostitute. That doesn't refer to Kathy, by the way. I'm talking about the poetry here, right? As a callow, bookish boy, I walked down the dark, windswept streets of Winnipeg, chanting lines from Hamlin Garland's "Do You Fear the Wind?" Do you fear the force of the wind, the slash of the rain? Go face them and fight them, be savage again. Go hungry and cold like the wolf, go wade like the crane. The palms of your hands will thicken, the skin of your cheek will tan. You'll grow ragged and weary and swarthy, but you'll walk like a man. Being steeped in Anabaptism, my writing had to be useful, something to create calluses on the palm or thicken the coverings on the brain, like carpentry, feeding cows, or reciting Bible verses. I wrote for occasions, birthdays, funerals, anniversaries. My valedictory talk from the Mennonite Brethren Collegiate Institute was a long poem. It was published in the Mennonite Brethren Herald and resulted in my first check for $2 from Christian Press. I never cashed it. I still have this check. It's probably not even worth $2 anymore, but for some unfathomable reason, perhaps because I was J.A. Toews' son, the MB Herald published several of my poems and letters over the next few years. In 1966, a letter from another Herald reader advised that the passage 2 Peter 2, verse 12 should be applied to me. For those who are not MB and hence don't know their Bibles so well, verse 12 is, "But these, as natural brute beasts, speak evil of the things that they understand not, and shall utterly perish in their own corruption." Writing as glory and punishment. Chipper Dipper come home to roost. January 19th, 1967, my first story was published in The Uniter, a paper of United College, University of Manitoba. A Helping Hand was called. It is a sad tale about an old St. Bernard, abandoned and dying in the streets of Winnipeg, who saves a young girl's life, is killed by a truck, and is taken away by the garbage men. Premonition? The idea that I might someday be a veterinarian was not even a vague fantasy. My high school English teacher predicted at our graduation that I would teach history at the Mennonite Brethren Bible College. We had to take a religion course at Mennonite Brethren Collegiate Institute. I remember one class in particular. It was about original sin. The gist of what I took away from that class was that if a non-Christian mother ran into a burning building to save her child, it was an act of selfishness. If a Christian mother did the same thing, it was a selfless act. There was us who were going to heaven and them who were going to hell. And you couldn't tell the difference by just looking at the external evidence. You had to know what was in the heart. In 1967, my parents left home. I know it's supposed to be the other way around, but I took the hint and hitchhiked from Winnipeg to Montreal, took a freighter to Europe, and vagabonded overland to India and Southeast Asia. On my journey, I was taken in by families who fed me, gave me a place to sleep, and generally treated me, a stranger, with great generosity and kindness. Were all these people going to hell, as my teacher had told me? Or were all the teachings of my childhood BS? Something far worse than a lie, but something indifferent to truth. In this retelling of my childhood in my head, the MBCI religion teacher became the evil one he had warned us against. Now, in a state of shock, depression, and awe, I had to figure out the meaning of life from scratch. If I couldn't trust the teachings of my childhood taught by people who had gained a state of unassailable righteousness by surviving the Russian Revolution, then I couldn't trust anyone or any system of ideas where ideas trumped evidence. At this point I classified Marxists, Buddhists, Hindus, Catholics, Muslims, capitalists, whoever, were all fundamentally indifferent to the world that I saw around me. In retrospect, this explains two major themes of my writing life: the desire to find a home for my deep skepticism, a community that would defer to some kind of evidence rather than to dogma, led me to science, and the desire to reconnect with humanity in some meaningful way led me to literature. In 1969, exhausted from my travels, followed by 6 months of working in a sawmill and believing in nothing, I went to Goshen College. In a 1970 letter to the Canadian Mennonite, Rudy Wiebe wrote a double-fisted kiss, Russian style of congratulations to David Toews. He writes with his head and his gut, and he is beginning to hate well. Little did he know how deeply that hate went. While at Goshen, after flirting with Zen Buddhism and studying the music and art of John Cage, Robert Rauschenberg, and Jean Tinguely, I put together a collection of my writings called Again the Enemy Soldiers, a Terminal Art Game, or alternatively, Nonsense, C-E-N-T-S, and Other Rates of Exchange. Nick Lindsay's comments on my work were, "I think it's delightful, but of course I think it's a lot of rubbish." To which privately I responded with a quote from Dostoevsky's brothers Karamazov. "Poetry is rubbish," said Smerdyakov curtly. "Oh no, I am very fond of poetry. So far as it is poetry, it is essentially rubbish." I took all this to heart, but kept writing. As I said, something very deeply genetic. In 1969, I initiated an exchange of letters with Jack Duick. If the universe had no meaning, I argued, then writing was pointless, which meant that I myself, being a writer, was of no consequence. I told Jack that my writing, since of course I could not stop, even though it was pointless, exhibited desperate silliness, giggling in the face of disaster, hallucinatory. My poems at Goshen were absurd, full of death, judgment, and hopelessness. My teacher, Nick Lindsay's influence, and that of his father, the former poet laureate of Seattle, was also palpable in the forms of my writing, the chanting rhythms, and the public performance. One poem from the time Animal Farm Comes to America begins, "The streets rumble under the thundering herds, flee to the mountains, crouch in caves, with gluttonous grunts, snorts of murder, flee from the muck of the open graves." It goes on for a while and then it ends, "Flee with your heart and your shirt undone, flee to the mountains, crouch in caves, for Circe, who turns men to swine, has come, and the world wallows down to the open graves." Or again, in a more quiet moment of despair, haiku, "On the white mountain, the bare stretched arms of a tree, there will be no spring." But being freed from having to advocate for an ideology, there was also a kind of wild, absurd freedom. This was 1969, after all. Despite my personal nihilism and sense of uselessness, I wrote relentlessly. Essays, plays, stories, poems, rhyming poesy, Bob Dylan-like lyrics, on and on and on. Nick Lindsay, of course, incited us to write, whether we believed in it or not, and Pinchpenny Press seduced us with promises of publication. For a time, I edited a student literary paper called The Other Wall. I have no idea what the first wall was, but that was the name of it. In 1970, under the pen name Shireen, again, I have no idea where that came from, I published a sonnet, Circus Animal, which was later renamed and included in That Inescapable Animal. I come from the Midwest, but don't let that fool you. I have seen elephants, camels, and poets uncaged that would make our virgin libraries blush and smudge the clear sheen wax on the floors of our banks and brothels forever. You can hear the Philippic part of this already, right? I have seen the circus tents rise up like pregnant zebras and deliver a litter of loving prophets into the streets. I have seen what the old man fears to tell. Every man must now play clown or beast, and even the Midwestern rocking chair is in the ring. The elephants are in our elevators, the camels on the stairs, the ringmaster howls on the corner with a clenched fist. Knowledge is afoot, let the libraries take care. Laughing free in the streets, the poet has escaped his lair. At Goshen College, two professors profoundly influenced my life and my writing. Mary Oyer, who taught history of music, arts, and Western civilization, and Mary Bender, who taught 20th century fiction and French language and literature. I would get up at 8 in the morning to hear Mary Bender's lectures and was riveted. She taught Sartre, Camus, Ionesco, Kafka, Don Passos, Woolf, Mansfield, Joyce, all the existentialists. And then she looked up at us from her podium. She looked up at me and said, "They have defined the problem. Now it is up to you to find the solution." This was my great commission. But how could I even begin when all those great minds had already foundered on the dark shoals of world wars? I could go on about the breadth and depth of Mary Oyer's knowledge of music and European culture and how she could impart a sense of the sweep and complexity of European art, music, and architectural history. But one story sticks with me in particular. She had gone to Africa on a sabbatical. Before that, she had taught that there was good music, with a capital G, and bad music, a right way to play and a wrong way to play. John Cage had argued that Beethoven was not just not interesting to him, but wrong. She argued that Beethoven was right. While she was in Africa, she tried learning a new African instrument. I don't recall which one it was. Let's say it was a thumb piano. When she asked the teacher if she was doing it right, he paused and hesitantly said, "Yes." She practiced harder. When she returned to the teacher and asked the same question, his yes was a little more certain. After many weeks of hard practicing, he answered with a big smile and a resounding yes. So in my response to Mary Bender's exhortation, I could start anywhere. There was no right answer as defined by some dogma, but surely with hard work and practice, which is what I learned from Mary Oyer, with keeping my eyes and ears and mind and heart open, which is what I learned from John Cage, there were ways to move in a right direction. Without any sense of where any of this was going, I kept writing. It seemed the only way. In a brief moment of peace, I wrote a poem in German for my grandfather's funeral. Nun ist fort, doch nicht gestorben, I wrote, nur vorangegangen. Did I believe this? Maybe only in German. In English, I rewrote the Lord's Prayer, in which I spoke of our kingdom of stone upon stone and life upon life and each life alone, and ended with, for ours is the tomb and ours is the earth. Amen. In 1971, Kathy and I were married. I finished my BA at Goshen, worked for a religious publisher in layout and design, wrote an incredibly boring novel, and wondered what I would do with the rest of my life. Having seen the utter poverty and wealth disparity in India and Southeast Asia, I needed to do something that was useful, real, engaged with life, and from which one might actually make a living. Actually, just the other day, I got a royalty statement from a poetry publisher, and the amount of the royalty was minus 54 cents. While lower than most, that's within the ballpark of royalties that one earns from poetry. So I might have been naive at the time, but certainly not about my assessment that one needed to have a source of income in order to do this kind of stuff. In 1972, I started studying science with a view to becoming a veterinarian. That would be practical. Even if I never wrote another word, I could do something useful in the world. Studying science was exciting, stimulating, grounding, and confusing. Here was a whole new body of evidence that defined different battle lines between what was admissible to ask in science and what was the domain of religion and philosophy. It was as if behind the belief in religion, as well as behind those who studied science, there was an even deeper prior belief that we lived in a fragmented universe. For many years, I was sucked into this binary mindset. I struggled with how one might integrate the two when the resistance on both sides was fanatical. The language of literature, which valued ambiguity and harmonic resonance, was completely at odds with the language of academic scholarship, particularly science, for which precision and perfect pitch were the ultimate values. From the start, I tried to bring them together, if only for my own sanity. In any case, I've never been a big believer in thinking outside the box. That assumes there are boxes. If they are there, they are only in our heads. The universe in which we live was not assembled in a big box store. In 1973, I published a poem, The Way of Memories, in the American Journal of Nursing. The poem begins, all that I have met as part of me, carried down secret corridors, electric passageways, down mysterious axon elevators, packed in molecules of RNA, stored in gray salt mines of cerebral cortex like radioactive waste. And it finishes, in the final moment, they will dissolve, and I will remember everything. As an aside, about 30 years later, I returned to a similar theme with a less sanguine ending in which the sanitary dream engineers clear out my memories and dreams on a daily basis. Those of us who are losing memories can relate to that. In the mid-1970s, while in veterinary college, I wrote a second novel, The Sasquatch Memorandum, under the pseudonym I'm a Buffalo. It was a farce about Western Canadian separatist movements with links to Quebec separatism. An editor at a Toronto publisher, Doubleday, liked it, but said that the topic was too timely and wouldn't be of interest by the time the book came out. It was a lesson, once again, about the multiple solitudes that are this country. In 1976, between my second and third years at veterinary college, I got a Canada Council grant to write short stories. I read and reread Philip Roth's Goodbye Columbus to figure out how one might do that, and started what 30 years later would become the connected short story collection, One Foot in Heaven. By 1978, at the age of 30, I had never actually written anything creative with the word Mennonite in it. but without stirring up all the anger and angst and cynicism that I associated with my MB upbringing, could I do this? I knew it would need to have food in it, otherwise it wouldn't be Mennonite, right? And since the real history of Mennonites was told by women in the kitchen and not the historians in the library, that voice would need to be female. My Aunt Truda, Maggie Dick's mother, was an obvious choice of role model here. In the end, I was saved by a long poem from Uganda, introduced to me by Mary Oyer through Kathy, who had taken an African arts course as a side to her nursing studies. Okat Bitek wrote The Song of Luino in 1966. He wrote in Luo, a decidedly non-mainstream African language, and it was translated, warts and all, directly into English. He called his style comic singing. Dancer, drummer, and anthropologist and social critic, he sang recklessly, full of love, and therefore without self-censoring his deepest feelings about the woes of modernization, of men rotting off to the big city, running after big city women and taking on big city airs, about corruption and infidelity and salvation, a song full of nostalgia, anger, hope, and what was this? Humor. I devoured the book-length tale-telling song at a sitting. That was me. That was my mother. That was all of us, straight from the Luo into English. And that became Tauta Tina, straight from mangled southern Manitoba Mennonite English. She became the poetic muse who saved me. She became my poetic voice for a decade, the 1980s, when many men were getting self-censored laryngitis. How could a white middle-class male with all the privileges and rights thereto attending have anything important to say at all? How could we get drunk and be miserable and happy without being accused again of some sort of wrong thinking or inappropriate feeling? So I did the only thing I could. I got out of myself, sex change and all. I became an older woman. This thing here, right? I didn't bring the dress, but this is this thing here, right? My first real Mennonite poems, Tauta Tina's Lament, Hensien's Blues, and Waldheim, were published in a Toronto magazine, Canadian Forum, in about 1979. Tauta Tina's Lament begins like this. Hensien is a fool, and I am his mother. Dear Lord, forgive us both. Hensien in the city struts like a chicken. He is wearing a pink shirt and plaid big-bottom hosen. When he was little, his bottom was like a zwieback. His little buns I spanked, and how he crowed. Now his tongue he wags at me and thinks I'm ignorant. He says farmers have no brains. They should all be businessmen. And then she goes on and talks about, again, the same things that this Luino was talking about was happening in Africa. We do not know how many people are money making. He wants to be rich like the English and from Managritza to save us all. His heart is tight as a pfefferness. His head is a pirishki with fruit stuffed. And then it finishes, oh, my son, my heart so heavy as thick as glums. If you come home, it will rise light and sweet. I will make you portsulcher for breakfast, and every morning the new year we will celebrate. So it ended on an upbeat note. Not only had I managed to write about Mennonites, but I had done so without descending into judgment and recrimination. I had to laugh, though, at the illustrations when the poems appeared in Canadian Forum. The illustrations were of old order Mennonites in black hats and kerchiefs. Toronto, right? What do they know? Another sign to me that every label, Mennonite, Christian, socialist, scientist, poet, is both an opportunity and a kind of trap. That every boundary we draw around ourselves is both necessary and is necessarily renegotiated day by day, fragile, temporary, not to be confused with the reality, and usually misinterpreted by those around us. Along with Kathy, our young children, and the cow poop and blood of my daily work, Tauta Tina grounded me in ways that I had not been before. Tauta Tina gave me a voice. Did I appropriate that voice? More accurately, I would say she appropriated me. I am, after all, the one who puts on the dress and babushka to wag my finger about Trudeau, Salman Rushdie, and the incorrigible stubbornness of Mennonite men, yeah? I am the one who loses my sanity and my rational epidemiological voice when she possesses me. Tina allowed me to accommodate science and storytelling, and to me, interestingly, she helped me regain a voice that was not Tauta Tina, to find other ways to speak across the chasms of culture, belief, science, and humanity. I continue to write myself into existence. Poetry, fiction, and nonfiction, essay, stories, and tirades. I edited a student paper during veterinary school. With a career in veterinary science and a family at home, there was no mental or physical space for sustained effort that longer works required. So now I had the income, but I didn't have the time to write. I recently came across a retelling of the Red Riding Hood story that I wrote in 1981, in which the wolf is rehabilitated after his death and finally honored. In fact, there's a eulogy by Red Riding Hood herself at the rehabilitated wolf's tomb. I wasn't sure what it might mean until a few years later when I wrote a poem called The Shadow. Loping over the moon-white ice, my soul's barely skimming the stinging crust, slim, mottled, luminescent trees around me, supplicating the moon's hem. I thrill unthinking in sheer, free flight across the black night. In mid-stride, in the corner of my eye, a shadow flits out of the cold, crackling trees, a lean, loping fear. It leaps. This is when Kathy heard me whimpering and woke me up. I explain at the breakfast table. And Matthew, at 6 years, before the very gates of the kingdom, asks, "Were you the wolf, Daddy?" So, hearkening to the voices of children and in the tradition of the priesthood of all believers, I had taken confession and absolved myself. Isn't that what that means? Priesthood of all believers? The mix of literature and veterinary medicine kept me sufficiently off balance that I could never aspire to that great Mennonite goal, pride in humility. It also helped me keep a sense of humor. In 1983, after a conference at the Mennonite Center in Intercourse, Pennsylvania, I received a letter that said, "Your writings were so delightful. I found my interest caught from the very beginning. Incidentally, do you treat hogs? We could use a good hog vet." It's pretty hard. He's just sort of getting up there. So, oh, she really likes my writing. Anyway. In 1984, when Larry Danielson wrote and put on a stage adaptation of my poems in Morden, Manitoba, I understood that there might even be a space for my voice somewhere in southern Manitoba. The poem about Rudy Weeb, Roots, I am told, got the biggest applause. I don't know what that means. I could read into that something about the necessary overthrowing of the elders, but I'm getting too far along myself to go along that road. I'm not going to read that one, but you can look at it later. In 1986, when we were in Indonesia, I attended a conference in Singapore of the Commonwealth Languages and Literatures Association titled Englishes of the Commonwealth. I read Taunt Tina and made an immediate connection with the British Guyanese writer David Dabadine, who said his own grandmother would tell the same stories with their own unique brand of English. So from Africa to southern Manitoba to Guyana. Interesting. That year, I got a handwritten letter from the religion teacher at MBCI that had put the millstone around my neck when I threw myself out into the world. His father was dying, and he had picked up my collection of poems, Good Housekeeping, in which I had poured out my feelings at my own father's death. He wrote to thank me, as it resonated deeply with him. He wrote that he remembered me affectionately. Damn, so much for the good guys and the bad guys. While in Indonesia in the mid-1980s, I also began my long, painfully rocky road back to writing fiction. For me, this reflected a need to go beyond Good Housekeeping and Tanta Tina to find a narrative that would accommodate the whole messy world in which we lived, to address the larger questions that Mary Bender had sent me out into the world to solve. I wrote a draft novella, but given my job, work, the family, responsibilities, poetry and essay still dominated my public voice. But the scope expanded. Again, Tina, never one to limit her ideas to the kitchen, was helpful here. In 1993, at the 20th anniversary of the Writers' Union of Canada, I was asked to read Taunt Tina's request to put Salman Rushdie on the missionary prayer list. Graham Gibson, Margaret Atwood's husband, suggested that I do it in costume, which I'd never done before. So I went room to room in the dormitory at the university asking if someone had a dress I could borrow. Then between the main course and the dessert, I went to the men's room to change. Apart from the sagging breasts made of hand towels, I was told it was very convincing. I was simply introduced as a woman from southern Manitoba, and the light was poor. Yeah, it was like this, and the light was down, so it worked. And the poem is basically, sometimes when I am the chickens feeding and the radio by the barn plays, even like a mother hen, the Lord is me to the kernels of his wisdom guiding. Many times has the Lord reminded me from the days in Russia, when the Indians in Quebec have their guns taken their graveyard to defend against a golf course. I have remembered the Bolsheviks and how they to our village came in a factory from the church made. Yeah, but this evening, this is not what I'm wanting to say to you. And then I go on and talk about what happened in Russia and the communists. And then finish in the middle of it, I say, this is why Stalin and Ayatollah and maybe even some Christians are not stories liking so much, because they think maybe God is in the story hiding like meat in a Fleischpürischki. And when we are opening the bun, God is on us checking to ask, how are we caring for the beautiful vineyard? Later, I couldn't recall whose dress I had borrowed, because I'd been in a big hurry just before the banquet. And the next morning, I had to stand up at the annual general meeting and announce that I had a woman's dress from the previous night, but I couldn't remember her name. The response was predictable, of course. Once Tina was out of the kitchen, she opened a great many conversations. She conversed several times with Peter Zosky on CBC, but more importantly to me, she was able to chatter on in situations that could just as easily have degenerated to slam doors and shouting matches. She was invited to speak at several conferences of the Mennonite Economic Development Agency, MEDA, whose members included successful businessmen with whom I have, over the years, had some differences of opinion. In 2008, Tina, in full costume, shared a stage in Altona with a very serious Roland Penner in a three-piece suit and tie, whose Jewish and Mennonite parents were among the founders of the Communist Party in Canada. But Tina could also be a trap. Could I write in my own voice? What language would I use? And I don't mean English or French or German. I continued to try to reconcile the apparently irreconcilable languages of scholars and poets. If my 1970 poem on death, Mortal's Prayer, was framed by the Lord's Prayer, the poem which opens my 1995 collection from McClellan and Stewart, The Time of Our Lives, is rooted in a celebration of the now. I am having the time of my life, digging up an old pine stump with my daughter in the bright fall sunshine, the poem begins. Everything I need to know about life and death is in this moment. The poem ends, as the roots lift free, I am dug in, rooted, earthworms, beetles, fungi, bacilli all around me, skittling up the spade handle toward me, singing, welcome home, your turn is next. Based on work like this, one of my scientific colleagues referred to me as a nowist. Still not sure what that means, but behind the public writing and performing, my underlying angst about the pointlessness of writing, the darkness that surrounds us, the problems of finding the right language, is there a right language, have continued to plague me. In 1999, apparently trying to reassure me, Julia Kasdorf sent me a quote from Robert Frost. The right word, it's just a matter of life and death, that's all. Thanks, Julia. That was really reassuring. But I'm unfair. She also did remind me that when the world got tough, I turned to poetry, not science, to give me courage to keep going. In 1997, before an international audience of epidemiologists in Paris, and as part of a presentation on complexity and health, I read a poem about mad cow disease, a bill from the power company, in which I explored how, even with the best science we have, tragic outcomes can spring from the most noble intentions. The poem resonated and was later published in a journal called Preventive Veterinary Medicine. Oddly, the way into longer narratives and finding languages that might say what I wanted them to led through the discovery of the ways in which stories inform science, the selection of which evidence is admissible, how we make sense of the evidence. It's become clear to me that the need for precise communication in science hides an underlying uncertainty, a conflicted and anxious humanity, and that the flat sharpness of the language is both a strength and a great weakness. Excuse me. Let me know if I'm going too fast, will you? I I tend to speed up when I get excited. In the last decades, through books like One Animal Among Many, Food, Sex, and Salmonella, and The Chickens Fight Back, I have explored the possibilities of new, integrative ways of seeing and talking about this amazing universe we live in. I attempted again to grapple with ecology and death in a poem, How the Earth Loves You. The light will break through, the poem ends, and the darkness together, and you will understand, finally, who it is who has loved you all this time so well. A different ending than just going to Earth or being retrieved by bugs and beetles. Tragedy, love, and open possibilities. In the past decade, I have written less poetry and more prose, partly because I feel as if I'm repeating myself, saying the same things over and over in different ways, and perhaps because finally I am able to embrace the complex anguish of the whole world, to love the bad guys as well as the good guys, to rediscover the bad guys and the good guys in all of us, to find shared languages with species that surround us. Hence, I suppose, my interest in writing Mennonite veterinary murder mysteries, to understand our own complicity in the world we co-create. It is no coincidence that the stories in One Foot in Heaven and Fear of Landing, and in the 3 novels currently calling to me from my computer, annoyed that I'm not giving them my full attention, constitute a kind of Mennonite family saga with the same characters growing through the confusion of life. They allow me to more fully explore the web of interactions and co-creation among parents and children, teenagers and chickens, community, history, dead cows, death, the lure of political and economic power, and the ways in which they are rationalized. These are the same questions I've been working on in my science for the past 2 decades. One veterinary student described The Chickens Fight Back as a religious book. I had to go back and look at that. She said that because apparently I have a lot of references to God in there, some of them with a capital G, some of them with a small g, and she wondered what the significance of that was. I suppose it is a religious book, but it is also a science book, a social commentary, and a storybook. I have come to value the distinctions less and less. Here's a brief excerpt from the final chapter. In 1001 Arabian Nights, the Sultan Shahryar feels betrayed by his first wife. He seeks revenge on women in general by having his Grand Vizier present him with a fresh bride every night, and then having her strangled by the Grand Vizier the next morning. Scheherazade, beautiful daughter of the Grand Vizier, decides to put herself on the line for the sake of all women. In a successful, non-violent stratagem, she recruits her less than beautiful daughter, Dinarzade. Every day, just before dawn, her sister awakens her and asks Scheherazade to tell her a story. The Sultan is, of course, listening in and is left at dawn wanting to hear more. Every day, the Sultan decides to spare her and eventually falls in love, first with her stories and then with her. He abandons his brutal, tyrannical, obsessive plans. She lives a long and meaningful life and is celebrated by young people and peace activists the world over. The tale of Scheherazade is finally a tale about all of us. The earth, like Shahryar, has cut the heads off many species before us. Global history is replete with sudden or slow mass extinctions. The earth is literally built from the bones and decomposed molecules of our forebears. We humans, too, have betrayed our hosts and the bacteria who collaborated to make us possible. If we are not soon to go the way of the Glyptodont and the Pterosaurus, then our global human family needs a good dose of psychotherapy. Not just any therapy, but a narrative therapy in which we have reimagined and retold our tale as one of survival, justice, ecological at-homeness, and conviviality. To find this story requires an effort beyond anything we have tried before. Like Scheherazade, our lives depend on it. And I end the book by saying, the biosphere might yet spare us. Or if the stories don't save us, they will, at least on our deathbed in the last days of our species, have us saying, we did quite all right, didn't we? We left a story of ourselves worth telling the universe. As I was preparing for this evening, I lamented to myself how my writing has been asking the same questions again and again and again. Is there indeed nothing new under the sun? Is The Chickens Fight Back another version of the brotherly Philippic, and the answer, love or die, the same? The comfort I get in this life is from the immediate, the world in which I am daily immersed. Family, friends, animals, trees, sun, children, baking pies, cooking supper, drinking wine, thinking about the true meaning of excrement. The novel, Fear of Landing, opens, There is something warm and comforting about doing an autopsy on a cow. It's real. You don't have to worry that they don't speak English or flat German. You don't have to speak Indonesian or Javanese. You forget about your addiction to chewing sunflower seeds. All you need is a sharp knife and all your senses on heightened alert. Touch, sight, smell, even sound. You lightly brush your hand over the coarse hair along the belly, feeling the stiff hairs flip back against your palm, ruminating on the life of this beast, one of those infinitely curious bovines, dwelling in her ever-present years with a kind of dim-witted patience that sometimes passes for wisdom. Perhaps, in a devious and fast world, this is indeed a kind of wisdom. Now, if I look back over this journey, my journey, the journey of humanity from the earth without form, from the darkness and the waters, I am amazed. Another sonnet. It's called Flying. We did not know to what we were committed when we stood up that day. The rush to dance, heirs to the earth, like fish lifting from muck on wings. That feeling of how good it was, what we had, the rush into the bronchioles, flushed with the burst up of pent-up possibilities, of what a chance we have. Reeling in air, we swaggered and bred, put on airs, strutting our songs, soaring up on wafts of gnosis among the clouds, and then the blur of birth and nesting, seeking after food, doing good, righting and righting wrongs, a lifetime of being primates, a little lower than the angels, at home on earth. But for a moment now we pause in the pale of late midwinter, amazed at what we've wrought, to what we have committed, our fire transformed, made real, a place of woods and streams, small animals and children, where grace in flight sings songs of air and flight again. Our fears airborne by alchemies of love, our certainties upturned by drafts, the only cure for life, our friends still swooping synchronously into the falling evening air. Am I asking the same questions as I did in the Brother Philippic? Perhaps, but I think the response is different. I'm going to read a few excerpts from a long poem. I won't read the whole thing here, but it's perhaps a more embracing. It was published actually in the Grable Review. It's called The New National Anthem, the morning shower version. I sing of myself in the shower, and then it goes on after some time. I sing in tears of love of my Germanic heritage, 4-part, 6-part, multi-hearted harmony, Beethoven, Bach, my grandparents, Adolf Hitler, Dietrich Bonhoeffer, and Albert Einstein, the millions who were massacred and the millions who made us who we are because they lived. I celebrate the Mennonites who would not kill and the anarchists who killed them. We are a cornucopia of history's compostables. Recycled rage, wisdom, control, chaos, a choir of Ayatollahs, Borks, Falwells, Herzogs, Netanyahus, Arafats, Stalins, Maos, John Pauls, and I go on. When I come around to the end, I say, let us create a movement and call it 1/4 Chinese, 1/8 black, some part Indian, Semitic, Arab, a pinch of Aboriginal, some Russian, Mongolian, a bit of monkey, and a little white is beautiful. Let us wiggle our butts, sing our faith and the delights of our impurity. Let us dance our despair. Let us love ourselves, all of us, in the deluge. Sing now, at last, to the lambs we were, what we lost sight of, have become, little tigers burning bright, our might undone, down on our knees. The sky a shivery blue clean, the crackling sun sizzling on this 4-dog day, rah, rah, welcoming us to another broken, dazzling day. A postlude. In July of 1968, in the midst of some of my darkest hours, I took comfort in a ratty copy of Gitanjali, song offerings, by the Nobel Prize-winning Bengali poet Rabindranath Tagore, with a preface by W.B. Yeats. I had picked it up at a street vendor in Calcutta. I carried it with me everywhere. Once, book in hand, I sat staring out to sea on a wide, hazy beach south of Orissa. A businessman from Calcutta, walking past in his suit, barefoot in the sand, saw what I had in my hand. He asked if I knew the melodies to these songs. I said I did not. He sat next to me, closed his eyes, and sang several of the songs to me, and then continued on his way. It was a small gift, one human to another. For my own writing, for my life, that is the best I can hope for, to pass on these small gifts that make it possible to go on. Thank you.
That was wonderful. Thank you so much. More than a small gift, a huge gift. David is prepared to take questions, a few questions. So if anybody has a question or a comment, offer them.
I can take them and then I can put them in my pocket or give them to Hildy, right?
No.
No, that's not how it works. It's worth a try. No questions? Excellent.
As a non-Mennonite, I'm curious as to whether the changes you made in your very earliest days in your as far as loss of faith resulted in you losing some friends, losing some family, losing some contacts?
You have to understand that that happened when I left Winnipeg. And there were decades when I knew I could never move back. And by the time I thought I might be able to go back there and live, it was too late. But I basically cut off my upbringing. I mean, that was part of what happened. And that was all mixed up in the fact that no matter where I went in Winnipeg, I was J.A. Toews' son. And I couldn't escape that. You'd go to the movie theater and people would say, we saw your son at the movie last night. You saw James Bond, or something like this. You couldn't do anything without it coming back to the church somehow and then reflecting on my parents. And it was a really small town for a Mennonite in that town. So did I lose friends? I lost contact with people in Winnipeg for many years. I kept contact with people who left, like Hildy. I have gone back since then, after sort of Tauntatina had more currency, and I did readings there, and it was interesting to me because it's amazing the barriers you can overcome with laughter. People start laughing and then they realize that they're laughing at themselves. It's too late. So yeah, I suppose I did lose some, but it was just part of that whole loss of my youth and then trying to reclaim it somehow in a different way.
But you went to Goshen.
I did. Well, Goshen, that wasn't even on the Mennonite Brethren map. I mean, you're going out into the worldly Mennonites out there, right? That's just, Goshen, that's not Mennonite. It's not real Mennonite, that's not like MBBC or MBC, or Rosthern or someplace like this. It was more. So it was, I went to Goshen. And in a sense, that was a kind of compromise for me because it was a way of leaving home, but not going back to Winnipeg. I actually had a full scholarship to go to University of Manitoba, which I turned down, and I had no scholarship to go to Goshen. But that was in part of it was they gave me credits for my grade 12 as first-year university. I had taken first-year university, so I got credit for that. So I came in as a junior, right, a third year. And then they had a requirement that you go on this SST semester, so you go abroad. So then I came back, I'd come back and I could get a BA in like 3 semesters. I mean, how good was that? This was the late 60s, right? So there were other sort of incentives to go to a place like Goshen. And it was, it was enough Mennonite that I could say I was going to a Mennonite school, but it was enough on the fringes that it wasn't like Manitoba MB, that's for sure. Yeah.
There are a number of us like you that left Winnipeg. And
I saw you sitting there and I was a little worried about that.
and look back and some with real bitterness.
Yep.
And how do you feel now about your days in Winnipeg, your understanding in Winnipeg?
I mean, it's hard. I am who I am because of all the things that I've experienced over the years. So in a sense, for me to say it was bad would be saying, well, this is who I am, right? I think there were all kinds of really warped things going on in that community. I think one of the things that really threw me for a loop was getting this letter from John Regier. And I was like, what do I do with this, right? He was one of the people that I had vilified, who represented sort of the worst of the dogmatism. And here he's saying, I really connected with your poems about the loss of your father and things like that. And I'm going, so okay, is there a way to start this over? And the only way I could do it was with a sense of humor. I mean, that's why, Tanta Tina, I could put on a dress and put on a babushka, and it's not me anymore talking, right? It's somebody else. And once I could do that, then I could, I could sort of manage that. I think I would have a hard time. I would have had a very difficult time going back to Winnipeg and living there and trying to deal with that. There was just too much baggage. I couldn't do it. I understand that, Mennonites in Winnipeg have changed over the years too. Surprise, surprise, right? We all change. So there's a sense of trying to be more inclusive on my part, and I think in general that tends to have happened to many, although we have a government minister who represents some of the things that it's actually related to me. Sad, sad day. Anyway, so not everybody was learned from experience. Yeah?
Is the precision of language in poetry and the precision of language in science the same precision?
No. And here's the reason. In science, and this is one of the fundamental conflicts, you're trying to be precise in a way that doesn't accommodate multiple interpretations. This is what happened. This is what we observed, right? And then, of course, when you get to the interpretation of there are several different ways of interpreting the results, but the basic scientific experiment, it should be conducted in such a way that people can go back and replicate it, and you get the same results every time, right? And there's an attempt then to say, if 10 people do the experiment, you come out with generally the same kinds of results, and you say, well, we're reasonably certain that this represents the real world. So, what was the question? Precision in poetry and the precision in science. So that it's different. In poetry, one delights in multiple meanings. I've had people come back to me and say, interpret my poetry in a certain way, and I'm looking at it and I go, I never knew I put that there, but it was there. And there's ambiguity and multiple meanings. And so the challenge in trying to bring those two kinds of things together is in a sense the kind of precision that science demands with the kind of multiple meanings that living in the real world demands, right? Because you can do all these precise experiments, some of which contradict each other, but in the end, somebody's got to make a policy decision or something which tries to accommodate people's desires and people's feelings and all these things that are not quantifiable. And so how do you bring those together? And so it's a challenge. I don't think it'll ever go away, but I enjoy that sort of a challenge, that kind of going back and forth. I think there's greater accommodation these days in science for ambiguity because there's a recognition that the more precise you get, you can be very precise and really biased, is what sometimes happens, right? And so if you're less precise, you have a big standard error. So there's a wide range of possibilities here, but it's perhaps less biased. So you have this kind of push and pull. And when you're looking at human experience, you're trying to work at the edges where those things overlap, where my personal experience overlaps with scientific experimentation. What happens in the lab where everything is controlled except this one variable, to the real world where nothing is controlled, right? And so the kinds of things that happen can be very different in the world out there than they are in the laboratory. So there's this kind of conversation, if you want, that happens.
Was Sarah Binks' sweet songstress of Saskatchewan?
Actually, well, I read her, but maybe unconsciously. I mean, if I look consciously at who are the poets that I modeled myself after, they would be people like Dylan Thomas, William Blake, Pablo Neruda, the Chilean poet, Mary Oliver, the American nature poet, those kinds of people who try to grapple with social and natural the social and natural world in a broad way. Sarah Binks, I mean, a little bit, that sort of tone of voice, but I certainly was aware of that, but not a major influence.
The question really is, how does the academic world almost demand at times that you have to enjoy the humor that it also provides you? I'm trying to get at where your humor comes.
Yeah, I was asked that actually once. There was a Men in That World conference in Winnipeg, and I did some readings, and I was interviewed on CBC. And I said the reason I could have a sense of humor was because I left town. The poets that stayed behind, like Patrick Friesen, it was a lot tougher for them to sort of be a little bouncy about it. I got out of town, and I went through this, as I said, I went through this incredibly deep loss of everything, and then tried to regain something, and what could I regain? And the only way I found to regain that sense of being in southern Manitoba was with some sense of humor. And what I found was that it actually opened doors to people that I would not otherwise have found myself talking to. That if you sort of talk directly at people, then you start going like this, which tends to be the Mennonite Brethren way was, at least when I was growing up, the way of doing things. And this kind of coming in obliquely and telling stories and getting people to laugh, and suddenly they realize they're laughing at themselves. But I'm also laughing at myself by doing that. So there's a kind of camaraderie that develops, saying, hey, we're all human beings trying to figure this thing out. And none of us has the answer. And then you get people once in a while, like a federal minister, Vic Toews, it's my cousin, who is not apparently amenable to that. He has the answer, and that's it. Right? What can I do? There was a question back over here. Yeah.
My question was similar to his. I was just wondering who your favorite non-Mennonite poets have been. When I was in undergrad, I mean, I studied, my first year English literature course was with somebody called Alice Hamilton, who was a very interesting academic who wrote about John Updike as a religious writer and so on. But then it was, at that time, it was Dylan Thomas, that use of language, William Blake, the grand divisions, John Donne, the great mixture of sex and religion. You know, if you're a teenager, that's perfect, right? And then later, Mary Oliver, Pablo Neruda, people like that. This kind of richness of life. Yeah.
Thank you, David, very much for that wonderful presentation. I'm struck by the fact that probably there are a variety of experiences people have had within that fecund womb of Mennonite Brethren life, including raucous laughter accompanying many life circumstance. But my question is a somewhat different one, and that is that kind of world that you describe, southern Manitoba, is a remarkable workshop out of which enormous writing creativity has come. Hildy's list of invitees for this series would be considerably shorter without that world that you describe as very repressive. What I'm asking is, do you think a really nice, tolerant, friendly, humor-filled world produces good literature?
Yeah. We've had that discussion actually at Mennonite writers conferences, the one here at Grable and then at Goshen and at Bluffton. That's been an ongoing discussion because the writing community in Canada has been considerably more dynamic that way. And certainly part of it is that angst. You know, that sense that if I don't get this right, I'm going to go to hell.
And you really feel it deep down inside here, right? And so you're wrestling with this even as you're trying to come to terms with things that make no sense in that way of looking at things, but somehow you're trying to wrestle with them. And yeah, I mean, you could say that Soviet Russia produced some great writers simply because of the repression. Does that justify the repression? No, but you're right. There is a sense in which that kind of dogmatism produces a kind of angst among people that they deal with in different ways. And some people go one direction, some people get creative, some people get, go off and they just succumb and they say, this is the way I'm going to do things. It is an interesting question. I guess I'm not sorry that I am who I am, and so then I have to say, well, I guess I should be thankful for that upbringing and that community that I grew up in. But I'm also happy that I left. What can I say? You're right, there is that dynamic, and that's one of the contradictions we live with, that as soon as you put tight constraints on something, people get really creative. And that happens in writing itself, right? And that's why I spent a whole summer writing sonnets. And it's a very tight set of constraints. What can you do within those constraints? Right? So you try all different kinds of possibilities. And I look at Winnipeg now, and there were all kinds of possibilities that were not there when I was there. Musical possibilities and literature possibilities and people doing things creatively within a set of constraints. And so the question then becomes, how tightly do you make those constraints, right? When our kids were growing up, I always tried to present myself as being more conservative to them than I actually was. And in part it was so that they could get past those restraints and get to a place where I had actually wanted them to be in the first place. Sort of a parental trick here. Seems to have worked pretty well, I think.
One more question in the middle there, and I think that'll be our last.
Yeah, and to some extent you've answered them. I'm noticing you said you had a few books calling to you on your computer.
Yes.
And two of them are the ones listed in the outline here. There seem to me to be two sides of your coin, as in scientific and journalistic writing.
Yeah, can I say this one? It's a biography of shit, actually. And the interesting thing about that word, to me, is that it has the same root, if you go back, as conscience, schism, science. It has to do with separation from the body, but also separating things into pieces. And it seems to me that speaks to something very underlying in culture. And so that's what that book is trying to wrestle with. So yeah, that's
Obviously show the two sides of you that you present tonight. Can you tell us anything about either one?
Well, I mean, the murder mystery that I'm in the process of revising has to do with corrupt Mennonites, drugs, that kind of thing. Veterinarians with less than good scruples, things like that, you know. It's right in the barnyard. Kathy, when she read the draft of it, said, "You're not going to make many friends in Saskatchewan, particularly around the veterinary college where I went." So I'm not here to make friends anymore. I'm retired now, right? I don't have to worry about making friends. So yeah, they're exploring different aspects of that. And to me, it's interesting because to me that sense of narrative that we tell, that there's this kind of social narrative that we tell, and scientists actually use a lot of narratives to make sense of, otherwise you just have a bunch of facts. And those facts only make sense if you make a story out of them, right? A bunch of dinosaur bones, that's a bunch of dinosaur bones, right? But you can make up a reasonable narrative that says, well, they evolved in this way, and that really actually kind of makes sense. Helps us to make sense of those kinds of facts. And so to me, that was interesting because there's an overlap there. And I like the idea that I'm living in a universe that is not multiple. There's not multiple universes, and I have to somehow blockade. Here's my religious life, here's my scientific life, here's this other life. I like to try to keep some sense of coherence to this. And I think there's some fundamental problems in our whole civilization, the way we've divided things up. And so this comes back to Mary Bender's task. How do you begin to put these things back together again?
Thank you again. I think we could probably sit here for another
No.
quite a long time, but we need to draw this to a close. Thank you so much for coming. Thank you, David, for just, I mean, it was terrific, and I hope. I'm thinking after last week and after this week, David, for sure, that the idea of inviting writers to talk about their careers in this way is just so enlightening. I love hearing it, and I have a feeling watching the faces on you, or watching your faces, that you do too. So I hope you'll join us again next week. We have many weeks to come and a few more MBs, but not next week. And I'm having to talk to David, but I'm hoping he'll give us this for the Conner Grable review, and we'll be able to ponder it some more. So thanks again.